met a couple years ago, and I was very, very impressed. She had just finished her journalism degree, and she was out there like hitting the pavement, and now she's all over the press. She's doing tons of stuff. So Christina is writing about cloud computing, health, IT, women in business, education, technology. She writes a lot for VentureBeat. She's also written for the San Francisco Chronicle, the Next Web, Digital Trends, and her byline has been in the Washington Post, the Telegraph, and more. Wow, Christina is rocking it. She has her master's from Stanford in journalism, and she's also an expert often on Fox Business, CNBC, ABC News. She moderates panels, and she speaks at tech conferences, and I haven't seen you for a couple of years, so welcome to the stage. Come on up. Yay. Good to see you again. I'm going to introduce your guests, but then you can introduce some more. You look fabulous.
Thank you.
How's it been? Yeah, you've been busy, right?
Seriously.
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually having a great time covering healthcare. So, this is my ideal panel, and this amazing group of panelists are my absolute favorite people to have here today. So we're going to have a lot to talk about.
Good. You know what? I'm going to hand it over to you and let you invite your guests up. So
Perfect.
After that, we'll have questions. So everybody, Christina, take it away.
So you want to come up and, yeah. We're going to have everyone introduce themselves so I don't mess it up. Do you want to get started, Camille?
Sure. Hi, everyone, and thank you, Christy, for inviting me and Women 2.0 for hosting all of us. Camille Samuels. I'm an affiliated director at Versant Ventures. I've spent 14 years in the venture capital world and have an emphasis on biotech as well as consumer health. And hopefully I'll be able to talk about both those interests in a useful way for you guys today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hallie Tecco. A couple years ago, I founded Rock Health. We are an early stage investor in digital health companies. Really excited to be here and talk about anything startup digital health.
Hi, I'm Surbi, and about 2.5 years ago now, started a company dedicated to filling the void in female health innovation. And we're creating 2 products. One is for infertility, and the other is for early detection of ovarian cancer.
And I'm Ted Driscoll. I'm a partner at Claremont Creek Ventures in the healthcare practice, digital healthcare practice. And frankly, most of our investments are in pretty hardcore genomics and diagnostics that affect the way a doctor treats their patient. Does he do A or B? Personalized medicine.
Great, thanks. An amazing group here with just, a wide range of interests within healthcare. So just to kind of kick things off and sort of touch on the main discussion or theme for our panel, which is the empowered healthcare consumer. I was lucky enough to be able to interview John Sculley, who was the former CEO of Apple. And he's actually now a healthcare investor out of Palm Springs. And one of the things that he said that really stood out to me is that healthcare is not going to be solved in DC, but in the home. Do you agree with this statement, or do you think that it's going to be a combination of kind of government and DC and consumers?
So I'm going to start. I'm kind of a brat on this topic. So I'm a brat on lots of topics, but I'm a brat on this topic. So I've given the founders of TEDMed a hard time about having that event be in DC because I completely agree that that's not where we're going to solve things. I think the microeconomy is going to come up with all sorts of wonderful ways to solve human health and to solve the American healthcare system, and then DC will adopt the best out of that. I also really believe in this notion of consumer empowerment in healthcare, and a lot of the companies that Hallie's working with are helping to empower the consumer that I like to serve with products and so on.
I absolutely agree with that. I think that so far we've seen a lot of ways that Washington, D.C. can hamper innovation, but as long as the entrepreneurs are moving faster than the regulators, I think we'll be okay.
So I might be a little bit biased, but I do think it starts and ends with the entrepreneurs. So I agree. I don't think that starts in DC.
Disagree with that.
Well, I will disagree. I think the term healthcare is too broad. I think there are chronic conditions which will be helped a lot by the consumer being empowered in monitoring. But when a doctor needs to make a specific decision, do you take Celexa or do you take Paxil when you're depressed? That's something that's really between the doctor and the patient. And I'm not sure that's something that people are going to look at an iPhone app for.
So just to sort of pick up on that point, healthcare is a highly regulated space. It does require a lot of expertise. You have to have relationships with doctors, with payers. Does this mean that any entrepreneur in this room without that knowledge and expertise could get into healthcare, or do you think that you need to build up that knowledge first?
Well, I'll start this one. We have approximately 18 healthcare investments that we've made in the last 5 years or so, and I think only one has an FDA path. Most of them are CLIA labs, or they're exempt in some fashion or another. What a CLIA lab is that you do a test, you get the result, and you give it to the doctor, and the doctor then makes the decision as to what they're going to do. And so that's an exemption from FDA regulation. A lot of healthcare nowadays is exempt from the FDA because it is being done in that fashion.
I have some thoughts on this. The healthcare system likes to think that people outside the healthcare system are too naive and they don't understand the problems and that they can't make a difference. And I just absolutely agree with that. Or sorry, absolutely disagree with that. And I think there are a lot of stakeholders in healthcare and there are a lot of complexities and they speak their own language, but any really smart, driven entrepreneur with great investors that can support them can overcome those challenges. And in fact, we need more people from outside the healthcare system to come in and really think about the problems in new ways.
I'll add another comment. I'm frankly, personally somewhat offended by the FDA's action against 23andMe. I think.
Let's talk about that.
Yes, because personally, I cannot believe that my government is telling me that I'm not allowed to look at my own genome effectively, and that, to me, is wrong. Maybe I need to have a doctor involved. Maybe they can mandate a genetic counselor or something be involved. But if you've gone to the 23andMe site, they give you an awful lot of background information around the reading that they give you. So as a consequence, I'm sort of surprised to see the paranoid FDA saying that they're going to stop 23andMe from providing genetic information to their patients.
I was on a KQED forum recently about this topic. It was me and two genetics experts, so I felt like the odd one out. But it ended up being this massive debate, and we just, someone would make a point, and then we'd easily find a counterpoint. It's one of those innovation versus regulation type of issues that we've seen come up again and again. Does anyone have an opposing view that maybe the FDA was right to crack down on 23andMe?
Don't all rush.
That makes for a boring panel.
Too much agreement here.
So then, having said that, I actually want to go back to the topic right beforehand and just underscore the notion that if there are entrepreneurs in the audience who are in any way intimidated by how obscure the acronyms like CLIA can be and so on, I promise that in 3 months you'd understand all of it. And please join us on the mission to improve healthcare.
Anyone got any, back to sort of the 23andMe tussle, any other thoughts?
Well said. It's frustrating.
Yeah. And the other thing about that is just sort of the notion that entrepreneurs who might get involved with healthcare see that happen and think, I could build a whole business over years and raise a lot of money and still, find myself in that kind of a situation.
I wouldn't bet against Anne. That fight's not over.
Yeah. And you have to think about it. The FDA was created in the thalidomide generation in a time when the patient didn't really know very much about medicine, and the doctor was frankly working almost in the dark himself with simple things like blood pressure and temperature and not very sophisticated tools. We now live in a big data world, where there is so much information that is available to the consumer. Now, when a doctor makes a diagnosis for me, I go home and Google it. and I get an expert in the damn thing and come back. So this is a whole different world, and the FDA is frankly out of its own depth now. It doesn't really know the world that it's trying to regulate right now.
Yep, healthcare is exploding. Just digital health, I've never seen anything like that. It's just really so much more dollars being poured into this space quarter after quarter. Just as sort of investors and entrepreneurs, within, if you're sort of deciding or thinking about a healthcare company, where to start? Is there, is digital health the right space, or is there another kind of area within healthcare where you'd love to see kind of more investment and more entrepreneurs?
Well, I'll tackle it if you want. The great thing about healthcare for me is that you're all customers. Every person on earth is a customer. There are a whole bunch of other sectors where it's only the energy guys or only the social networking guys, but everybody's a customer in healthcare. Everybody is going to use it at birth, and they're going to use it throughout their lives, and they're going to use it as they decline and die. So as a consequence, I think healthcare is a great place to be because there's just no end of customers, and it doesn't vary depending on whether the economy is up or down. People get sick regardless of whether the Dow is at 100 or 10,000 or 16,000.
And I would just add to that, healthcare is so behind in technology that it's not about creating technologies that don't exist yet. It's about applying technologies that have existed in other industries and have been proven in other industries for years and bringing them to healthcare. So there's a huge opportunity for non-technical founders that might not be interested in doing the R&D of a technology, but are interested in the commercialization. So there's just a huge opportunity to apply these lessons that we've learned in other industries to an industry that's just so behind and changing so rapidly.
And at the same time, I believe that we need to keep investing in the pure medical device, pharma products, because people will eventually get sick. And I think that empowering the consumer is also, if you're at high risk for ovarian cancer, giving them options to actually detect to see if the cancer is growing or not. What does that mean once you have that information? So I think investment on both ends is really important. And of course, again, biased, given that I'm developing products that require FDA approval and are catheter-based.
Well, digital health is going to exceed med device this year in funding.
Well, that doesn't surprise me at all. There's no one doing medical devices anymore. Sorry.
Well, I will comment that when I was in college and I saw the guys who were pre-med, they were the chemistry guys. They were the guys that I was hanging out with were the keyboarding guys, the guys who were talking to the computer on a CRT. The doctors were more the soft chemistry, the analog guys, not the digital guys. And I noticed that even today. I noticed the doctors I go see aren't real comfortable with digital. This whole concept that they're typing on keyboards now when you see them, for example, is a little fresh for some of these guys. So it's one of the challenges, I think, frankly, for the startup world here is to come up with ways to help the doctor become digital because the world of medicine is becoming digital.
That's a really interesting point. And that sort of, is probably more of a health IT problem to tackle. So question for you, Hallie. With health IT is, one of the, you just said it was now more investment being flowed into health IT than med devices. So just booming. One of the issues that investors who don't touch healthcare would always tell me is that they don't invest because they're looking for companies that are going to be sort of cash flow positive and make revenue within 3 to 5 years, and healthcare is longer than that. Do you think that's true of digital health? Is it different because it is more tech meets healthcare?
I think it's actually right in between traditional healthcare and technology. So it's not as fast as consumer web in terms of adoption rates, but it's not as slow as traditional healthcare. And we're seeing investors really from both sides, and they really bring kind of unique expertise looking at different aspects of the business. So tech investors are really excited about this space, but they're a little bit impatient. So they're excited about some of the companies that are maybe they don't have to go through regulation or kind of have businesses that they can understand. I think a lot of them are a little frightened by things that healthcare investors have been battling for years and years. And then I think healthcare investors, the only disadvantage is that they might not be able to evaluate the technology the way a tech investor can. But once they're comfortable with the technology, they are very patient because this is actually a lot faster than the deals they've done in life sciences.
Yeah, so building on that, so and I don't personally invest in digital health, but I said I'm very eagerly watching it empower my consumer. So I would say that the timelines that you were talking about are the regulated timelines. And most of these digital health companies are not regulated, so they shouldn't take as long. As a more traditional healthcare investor, my biggest concern about digital health, or health, it was called healthcare IT and e-health before that, is that there haven't been a lot of successes. So I was apprenticed with this notion that apprenticed to venture capital with this notion that, Camille, look for the existence theorems or look for the comparables out there. And there aren't that many. So we're kind of still creating business models that are going to work. And then my second concern, that when I see most of these companies, and I still see a lot of them, is a lot of them are what I call cupcakes. They're tasty but not filling enough. So they need to be big enough businesses, right? And so how do we find the digital health companies that are going to have a business model that works and they're going to be bigger than a cupcake?
I'll add one other thing. If you're going into healthcare, you better understand the reimbursement codes and the reimbursement environment, because most of the cost of healthcare is paid for by insurance companies using people's medical insurance of one sort. And with Obamacare trying to get everyone under some level of insurance, that's going to be increasingly the case. And frankly, the biggest challenge my companies face is not the FDA. It's getting the insurers to reimburse us.
Well, I'll just add one thing. I mean, healthcare is a multi-trillion-dollar market. So if you can't find a big niche within that, then shame on you. But if you do find something that's a smaller niche that might not be venture backable, and you can still make a difference in human health, then go for it. It's not all about getting VC money. You can build a company that is making a big difference and supporting you and creating jobs. And just because it's not VC backable doesn't mean it's not worthy.
Yeah, I guess in the pure healthcare world, it's widely accepted that our biggest hurdles are with reimbursement now, not with the FDA and with regulatory approval. So for those of you thinking about starting a healthcare company, even in the digital space or wearables, if the FDA does get involved, like that's fine. Like eventually you'll find a way to deal with it, just like traditional healthcare has done. And like Hallie was saying, the markets are big enough where it might justify the additional investment you need to get approval. You know, like it's an additional hurdle, but it's not insurmountable.
So we said the magic word, which wasn't cupcakes, but Obamacare. And I think we should talk about healthcare reform. So while you've got the mic, I'd love to hear your perspective as an entrepreneur. Was it easier to get investors to talk to you, to be interested in your company with kind of the healthcare reforms, high tech, and then the Affordable Care Act?
It would have been if I had gone out for my Series A not directly before all of the healthcare stuff fell in place. I think if, at the JP Morgan conference this year, the vibe was much more positive, just because we know now what the path is going to be and kind of what the hurdles are, where before we didn't know where it was going to land. So yes, it would have been easier.
Can you tell your story a little bit about your company, because it's just one that stood out to me from thousands that I hear from.
Oh, thanks so much. So going back to sort of where healthcare investment should be going, for me it begins with the need, right? So if you're in healthcare, the reason that it's worth facing all of these challenges is at the end of the day you get to help a patient. And this topic of empowering patients is really interesting to me, because I actually began my journey as an entrepreneur as a patient. So I was in a place where there was a mass and they didn't know whether or not it was ovarian cancer, and it was sort of a 6-month period of just waiting and watching and seeing what happened, right? So like Emerson said, a good indignation brings out all one's powers, right? So if you can find something that gets you that upset, then go for it. So about the company, we started in January 2012, and that's where my interest in women's health comes from.
And what's the company? Tell us more.
Yeah, so 2 devices. The first is a way for the physician to diagnose the leading cause of infertility in women, that being fallopian tube blockage. Now, all of my shareholders and early investors know this. They know that my goal is to create a device which will help early detection of ovarian cancer. the reason I ended up starting, or beginning, I should say, with that product is because at the time, there wasn't enough science backing that the most lethal forms of ovarian cancer actually begin in the fallopian tube. But I studied the fallopian tube, and I found this other need, right? So at the time I was raising my seed round, the National Cancer Institute had put out a paper saying that this is what's happening conclusively. But as the company grew and I kept my eye on it, then it was Johns Hopkins and UCSF. But by that point, we'd already been positioned kind of perfectly for it, right? So what we're creating now, we have the infertility product as well. But it's a test that's just like the pap smear that gynecologists can use with high-risk women to see if cancer is developing. And that way, they don't need to rush to have an oophorectomy, right? Which is equivalent to a castration. It's a very, very big deal. So that's what we're doing now.
That's amazing. Thanks for sharing your story. So something like an early detection medical device, this theme of early detection, of keeping patients healthy rather than, dealing with them and trying to cure them when they're already very sick, is a big part of what healthcare reform is all about. What do you think are the sort of opportunities for entrepreneurs given kind of this, what they call kind of volume to value transition in healthcare?
So I have a kind of an irreverent vision around this, which is if you look at most of the plans that people are actually adopting, the 3.3 million users now, most of them are really high deductible. And so I actually think that paradoxically, the ACA is actually going to push more towards this vision of consumer empowerment, because if you're the first $5, $10, $20,000 in a given year's healthcare expenses you're actually paying for yourself, you will get smart. And as an obscure as healthcare can seem today to the typical patient, or I call them consumer, cars are really freaking complicated, and I don't understand them, and I can die behind the wheel. In fact, I'm a terrible driver. I'm much more likely to die behind the wheel than other things. And yet people trust me to buy a car. And I think we've been way too paternalistic about patients, and that we should empower and trust them to make more of their decisions. And again, I think the ACA will actually push us in that direction.
Well, I will say that one thing, I'm not disagreeing with you, I agree, but I will say...
It makes for a more fun panel.
I have kids in their 20s who think they're immortal, okay, and they're not going to sign up for insurance because they don't think they're going to die. And to a certain extent, there is an aspect that some patients don't take care of themselves that much because they're still very young, very healthy, and they haven't sort of seen the future a little bit. Okay.
Yeah. So let's continue that conversation. So, a diabetic. Mm-hmm. Today, the system has given a diabetic the sense that it's not my responsibility, really, because they're the least compliant patients in the world, typically. I mean, I'm talking about type 2, typically. Often, diabetics, because of FDA and physicians and so on, aren't being given aren't being communicated by the system today, that it's their responsibility first and foremost. And that's the piece. I think with chronic disease or well-being, that's where I see this consumer empowerment thing. My mother died of cancer, and from the moment she was diagnosed, she no longer was an empowered consumer. She was a really sick woman, and at that point, it's all the healthcare system, and it's the existing system. I'm not denying that.
I agree. Well, I would like to see the healthcare system use more positive incentives for people maintaining good health and doing good things. Right now, you can effectively get no incentive to go out for a run in the morning or something like that. You just get reimbursed when you present with obesity or something like that, or diabetes. So I would love to see our healthcare system think more about wellness as opposed to treating sickness. And it doesn't do that so well right now.
One of the huge trends that we've seen in healthcare of late, which is sort of often positioned for patients as a way to be informed about their own health, is this wearables trend. And I sort of go back and forth on being very gung-ho about it.
They won't have all heard of wearables. Fitbit.
Fitbit, yeah, a fitness tracker is a wearable. Also, just from purely healthcare perspective, something like a glucometer. Remote patient monitoring is another area of wearables. So do you think that, or do you buy into the wearables trend? I mean, are you looking at these kinds of companies, or is it just like a lot of, press attention that isn't really deserved yet?
I think the first ones that'll be successful are the ones that can make a case to the insurance company that if the patient wears this and pays attention to that data, they will have to reimburse less in the future. So it's ones where the system sees the economic benefit associated with it. Those are the ones I think will be successful first. The ones that make you look a little better or feel a little better but don't actually cause the insurance company or somebody else to save money are going to be tougher. They're more, elective things than they are valuable.
Well, I'll add, there are very real businesses being built that exist today, Fitbit being a great example. Yeah. I heard through the pipeline some of their numbers. Like, it is very impressive, the businesses that are being built. And I think there is some skepticism because a lot of these wearable devices are just glorified pedometers. Like they're just all the same kind of wrist factor. And so that doesn't excite everyone, but I think what we have to keep in mind that this is like very early generation, and we need to keep on learning and prove that there's a market and build a market so that they can get smarter and become more embedded into our everyday clothes and not think about it as just this thing we wear around our wrist, but what it can be in 5 years and 10 years. And that's where it gets really exciting. So I'd say all signs right now point to this is real. This is there's a market for these things that aren't doing a lot. Imagine when they're actually measuring things that can add tons of value and be reimbursed.
Yeah, so just building on that, so when I first heard about the wearable space, I was super skeptical. But in that, when we're talking about Fitbit or the Up, that's purely consumer. And number one thing in consumer is you are not the consumer. Well, it turns out that I subsequently saw a talk by the Futures Company. It used to be Yankelovich, and it's they study consumer behavior in America, and they have a health-focused consumer behavior study. And in September, they published it, and there's 7 different consumer segments, and one of them is of the quantified self group. And everyone in this room knows some quantified self person, someone who constantly wants to know their health status relative to everything, and those are the early adopters of the wearable technology. I am not a quantified self, so I didn't get it initially. I think the wearable space gets to be really, really big when it goes beyond the quantified self folks, and we find the killer apps.
You know who's going to help that is Apple and their iWatch and all of the healthcare people they've been hiring. I guarantee this year they're going to be putting something out that does have some sort of healthcare application. And thank God, because Apple creates markets. So this is a great sign for entrepreneurs.
I'm dying to see that thing.
Seriously. It was actually fascinating. I was at the CES going through the digital health section. There were so many wearable devices, but if you mentioned iWatch to anybody in any of the booths, their eyes all dilated immediately because they all are scared to death. Yeah. Okay? And I think what Apple may have perceived is that, in fact, the iWatch is not a standalone device. It's part of a network of the iPad and the iPhone and different things connecting and doing the various things. It's not an isolated problem. You're going to want to measure a lot of different things about your body, and you're going to want to have a platform and a communication center for all of that stuff. It's not just measure one parameter.
I've seen some cool stuff actually out of wearables in the last few months. There's a company in Israel called Orcam that's building glasses for people who are either blind or losing their vision. And the idea is that you could sort of point to anything around you and it would be able to detect, that's a tree, that's a car. And so, they're hoping to be able to see for people, which is pretty incredible. So when you hear about things like that, it's like, okay, I'm less skeptical now. So sort of final question before we kick off with some Q&A. Transparency. This is sort of, we've been seeing all these articles in the New York Times and so forth about just procedures costing, widely varying amounts from one hospital on one side of a neighborhood to another. It's very, consumers, we talk about the empowered consumer all day, but if we have no idea what we're spending, how could we possibly be empowered? And do you think that's going to change? Are we going to see more open data and transparency in healthcare?
I hope so, because from the standpoint of innovation as well, it hurts innovation. Because if a company has to spend $250,000 doing a reimbursement analysis because each state is doing something differently, it makes it a lot harder to understand what products are going to be consumed.
I think there is a need for transparency. There's no question that it's silly to have two hospitals, one across the street from the other, one of them charging twice as much for the exact same procedure. That being said, I also saw a paper recently that said that some cancers now, the survival rate at 5 years is much higher in certain leading institutions than it is in local community hospitals. That the fact is some of the community hospitals are writing off of a fixed playbook that was written 20 years ago, whereas some of the leading institutions, the MD Andersons and the Mayos and things like that, are using new techniques that are much more personalized and therefore getting much better results. So as a consequence, I think there will be a variation.
Whether the price is actually more expensive at the community hospital
that
or
may
at the,
be.
Because I think to your point, the pricing has not been correlated to quality, particularly at all in healthcare.
That's true, and that needs to be fixed.
Well, transparency, there's another idea for all the budding entrepreneurs in the room. So we only have 20 seconds left. And rather than try to cut you guys off, let's do some Q&A. Does anybody have a question for our panel?
So we're a web dev shop, and we've worked with two startups in the healthcare industry. And one of the things that keeps on coming up is the whole HIPAA compliance issue. It seems like it's a pretty serious thing, but it's also incredibly vague. There's no real rules as to what you're supposed to do. Do you have any advice or experience on that?
This is the other side of the transparency issue. Is that you don't want your insurance company necessarily to see your genetic data. In fact, it's against the law with the GINA Act. This is a big problem. Is that you do want privacy to a certain extent, but on the other hand, medicine will benefit from getting access to a lot of genomes and beginning to understand the associations as well. So this is one of the most difficult problems, quite frankly, that we face at the current time in the big data world in medicine is what should be public, what should be private, and who should control it, and there are no easy solutions.
I think the hardest thing about HIPAA is remembering how to spell it. It's actually just a checklist, and Amazon, Web Services is HIPAA compliant. There are tons of services out there that are for developers, for health developers, that they can use until they scale. But it's literally just a checklist, and from what we hear from entrepreneurs, it's something that seems intimidating, but once you kind of get into the details of it, any great developer can follow the protocol and ensure that their product is compliant.
Just building on that, there are several categories in healthcare like HIPAA where you can find that one precious advisor, and frankly, that precious advisor could help 200 companies in the space at the same time. Just figure out, how to deal with it. It provides constraints, but it is by no means self-limiting constraints.
It's true about spelling. I think I've messed that one up quite a few times. Next question. Scarf.
Hi, how are you? My question has to do with preventative care and the cost and who's going to pay for it. I've done some work in the healthcare space, and Obamacare covers virtually nothing. So do you think that consumers are going to start to have to open up their minds to paying for more things out of pocket? Do you think that they will? And how do we bridge that? People are coming up with all these cool things like Fitbit and all that stuff, but it's going to be an out-of-pocket cost. So how do these companies get you to pay for these things? Because insurance companies are not going to do it.
You can get insurance companies to do it if you can justify an economic analysis for it, right? So, for example, if you catch ovarian cancer late stage, the medication alone, Avastin, costs $100,000 per year per patient, up to $200,000, and that doesn't include radiation or chemo. If you find it early and the patient has an oophorectomy, that costs $10,000. So it just depends on where the economic analysis lands.
I think it also, I mean, the wellness market is a $36 billion market, so a lot of these preventative tools do fall into that, and consumers are used to paying out of pocket for that. But if it is something that's more, healthcare oriented, it's all about the ROI and when that's realized. And if it's something in the short term, and a patient has high deductible plan, like myself, I have to pay the first few $1,000s before my insurance kicks in. If I know I'm doing something now that's going to prevent anything that I'm going to have to pay for, 6 months to a year from now, like a screening, I'm more likely to do that cost benefit in my head. So I think it's all about the ROI, or if we can push it into and market it as a wellness tool, because people have been paying out of pocket for wellness things, supplements, gym memberships forever. Well, not forever, but for a long time.
I've seen a few startups go with the strategy of trying to keep costs low at the beginning, and then sort of build up a following within the medical community, mainly doctors, and they will start demanding that device or test, and then eventually kind of then turn to insurance providers and say, look how much support we have within the medical community already, and then become something that you can reimburse. Okay, next up. Over here.
Hi, my name is Christy, and I work for a marketing agency that focuses on healthcare clients. So this is really interesting, and the topic that we've been talking about today is the consumer. The consumer is not just a patient. In the healthcare sphere, I feel like the consumer is also the HCP. So I was just wondering if you had any advice on how to best reach an empowered HCP or physician, because they're also buying into different types of media, and how is digital health playing a role in that?
Great question, thanks.
Well, I guess I'll tackle that one. You have to then suddenly start focusing on issues around liability and malpractice and things like that when you're talking to healthcare providers. Because if you give them a tool that has a false positive rate or a false negative rate of some sort or another, they're taking the liability, and that can be very expensive to them. So my experience has been, when you want to basically appeal to the doctor, you've got to have really strong science behind what you're doing. You've got to have some clinical results that are done at a respected institution of some sort or another, because doctors are somewhat reluctant to take on a tool that will tell them 99 times out of 100 the right answer, but the one time out of 100 they get sued for $30 million.
I'm also going to provide the additional cynical response, which is that physicians, they actually don't even consciously know how much their own checkbook is also guiding their decisions. So if you can be careful and thoughtful in helping them understand how the tool or technology is going to improve their bottom line, that will also help drive adoption.
I'll just add one more thing. We have maybe 1 or 2 companies in our portfolio that are selling to physicians. And I'll say the good news is there's only 800,000 of them in the US, so they're pretty easy to find.
Cool. I think we got time for another question.
Hi. So I have a question for you, everyone on the panel. What would you say to someone that isn't yet in health care industry, but is an engineer that would like to break into that space? What advice would you give?
I'm actually going to recommend a textbook. I know that sounds really weird, but there's an amazing program at Stanford called Biodesign, and I'm not plugging Biodesign or Stanford because I did not go to Stanford. I went to Berkeley, so me doing this is actually a big deal. It's a big deal. And this book, Biodesign, it's a handbook on how to start a healthcare company. So it touches upon reimbursement, so all of the acronyms that might sound a little bit foreign, it defines all of those, and just it's a great book overall, and it's a great program. So
I'll make the observation that increasingly we're seeing startups where the people who are doing healthcare startups aren't coming necessarily from a healthcare background. They're coming from an IT background. I can tell you one of the biggest companies in my portfolio right now that's doing extremely well is founded by an electrical engineer and does genetic testing. So I think the world of medicine is becoming much more techy, much more IT oriented. And you don't need necessarily to have a medical degree or a degree in microbiology in order to start a healthcare startup.
I'm going to self-promote and say go to rockhealth.com. We have tons of resources, videos, reports, everything that's kind of like 101 for entrepreneurs that are breaking into healthcare. We do events, so rockhealth.com.
VentureBeat.com. No, I'm kidding. One idea is to consider, if you have an idea already, a co-founder who maybe has a medical background. And another is to join an existing healthcare company because, let's face it, you're an engineer, everybody wants to hire you. Plenty of options.
I will add one thing, though. If you do start a company, it's a very good idea to get some doctor, some person who practices in that field on your advisory board or as an advisor in some fashion or another. Because it is difficult to convince venture capitalists that 3 guys with fine arts degrees can suddenly solve prenatal diagnostics or something like that. You do need an OB or a geneticist in your advisory board at least.
Yeah, I would prefer personally that you have a cache of them because I think individual physicians will provide you with biased responses. So I love the entrepreneur, and I would love the entrepreneur in tech too. This isn't specific to healthcare, but who has gotten to understand their consumer really well. So if the consumer is a healthcare provider or the healthcare provider can be a window into the ultimate consumer, talk to them early and often.
Yeah, and it's not just for the investors that you're speaking with the physicians, right? That's how you validate your concept and your product. There's no way that you as an engineer, completely outside of the health, completely outside, but outside day-to-day medicine can really say whether or not you're fulfilling a need. So speaking to the physicians often and early, every design iteration is really important. And it does make your investors happy, and that's important also.
So we have run out of time, but it's been a really amazing panel and discussion. And I think sort of what I've taken away from this is that really anyone can start a healthcare company. You've just got to have the right group around you, the right set of advisors. Don't be intimidated because I can't imagine anything more rewarding than helping patients in this particular space.
And guys, Chrissy was sick and she was an amazing moderator, so let's give her a special hand.